Hello, this is Toby. Just a few words from me before we get going with today's episode. When we started this podcast about a year ago, I figured the main audience would mostly be people who already work at the interface between science and policy or who study it. So science advisors, government officials, I guess academics who work in that area, and so on. In other words, the same kind of people who actually appear on the podcast. And in general, that is the case. That's a big part of our audience as far as I can tell. But there's another part of our audience which, with hindsight, foolishly, I didn't really anticipate. Some people who listen to this show are scientists, researchers who don't work in science advice at all. They work in other areas of academia, but they have an interest in finding out how the work they can do, whatever it might be, might have an impact on future policymaking. So a lot of these are like early career researchers, graduate students, and so on. So alongside a regular program of conversations about the ins and outs of science for policy, I've had a fair number of requests for some content addressing specifically issues facing early career researchers and how one might make the first move, as it were, from the ivory tower to a place where your work can influence policy. And I'm very happy to oblige. So we have a series now of 2 such episodes coming up. Today's conversation is with Adriana Bankston from California, who's made a name for herself in helping people make exactly that move, as you will hear. So this is a very practical, very career-focused type conversation. And then our next episode in 2 weeks' time, I hope to be a conversation about what it's like for students to enter the world of science advice scholarship for the first time. So what observations they bring about the field coming from outside. I really think there's a lot of value in these conversations, even for our more experienced listeners, the people who know this area very well. I certainly found it really interesting to get these different perspectives, not that I'm particularly an expert anyway. Anyway, today's guest also asked me to mention one thing specifically, which is always the case on this podcast anyway, but bears mentioning now and then. She, like all my guests, speaks from her own personal perspective and does not represent her employer, in this case, the University of California. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed this little pair of episodes. As always, thanks for listening, and please do get in touch via podcasts@sapea.info if you have any feedback or ideas for future episodes, or I don't know, just want to brighten my day. See you on the other side. Hello, welcome once again to the Science for Policy podcast. My name, as always, is Toby. And today I'm joined by Dr. Adriana Bankston, who, at least for her day job, works for the University of California as a principal legislative analyst at the federal level. She's also chief executive of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, with an academic background in biology and biochemistry. And as if all that wasn't interesting enough for our purposes, she now also works to help early career researchers make the move into policy fields, and she advocates for the changes in higher education that we need to support that. So, Adriana, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Toby.
So, let's start with your role at the University of California. What's that all about? What do you do there?
Yeah, so in a very broad sense, we advocate for priorities of the University of California system with Congress, the administration, and federal agencies. So what this means is a lot of pushing our priorities in Capitol Hill, analyzing legislation that's relevant to higher education and research. And there's been a lot more discussion now with, especially with the pandemic, in terms of the research pipeline and how, early career researchers and grad students are affected by the pandemic and their future careers in science. So I think that our portfolio has shifted a little bit more from just pure research advocacy to the workforce as well, which, as you mentioned, dovetails well with my own interests as well.
Right. And I would guess that a lot of what you work on are common interests shared by other universities. So it's not just standing up for the University of California alone, I would imagine, but also the whole sector.
Yeah, there are a lot of general issues in higher education that a lot of institutions advocate for. A lot of times, actually, that does happen in a common advocacy as well, because if there's something like we want to advocate for increased NSF funding, for example, then it's more likely that might go through if you have several universities that sign on. We also have higher education associations that sign on to that. So there's a kind of a common ask from the community for some of these things. And that a lot of times goes through much easier because it is a general ask.
All right. Well, I'm sure that keeps you busy. And since you also have this kind of side gig in helping young researchers to move from scientific career paths into areas where they can influence policy, well, I presume from the job you now do that this is a move that you yourself made in the past.
Yeah. It's been a move. Probably took about maybe 3 years or so just to really build up a solid portfolio and policy. And part of that was sort of my own exploration of where I wanted to take my career. And most of it sort of trying to figure that out, but also build the skills and the portfolio that I needed for a policy job like I have now.
Well, would you recommend it? Why would a promising researcher want to jump ship and work in policy instead?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what I enjoy about it is the ability to look at issues, like especially across institutions. And obviously my space is very focused on institutional policy, but really looking at, what things look like as far as trends in higher education across the United States, which I think is very interesting, gives you a really good view of sort of where you stand, what issues you need to work on. That's very different from coming from an institution when you're doing your PhD, you're sort of, entrenched in your project and you're very focused on that one thing. This is a very high level, broad view of things. So that's one of the differences between, I think, the academic and the policy world, that this is very much a sort of a generalist kind of role where you're dabbling into a lot of different topics in your day as opposed to, your one project. But I enjoy this kind of this broad and high level view of these issues.
And if there are people listening to this conversation who are considering or who might consider working somewhere on the interface between science and policy, can you give an idea of the kinds of jobs that exist there? How broad is that range?
Yeah. So one thing to note is, policy itself, I think, is a very broad term. There's a lot of different things in this umbrella. There is also the advocacy side. If you're actually pushing your policies forward, as opposed to policy, which is, government, they don't actually advocate, but they collect information. National Academies is another example. These groups that are really valuable, and they collect, data and information about these issues, which are then used by other groups to advocate for those issues, right? Because they do advocacy. So,
yeah, that's a useful distinction between advocacy, as you say, and more kind of knowledge sharing or knowledge gathering. Does that translate also into different settings, different kinds of employers?
As far as the settings, I think government jobs, are pretty popular and good, stable positions. I think it's kind of varies depending on what you want to do day to day and also the issues you want to work on. So I would say you might be more on the research side versus, if you do lobbying full time, that's sort of the other spectrum. Most jobs, I think, are in between and you kind of do both. But then you could also advocate for something that is, for a small association or a small nonprofit that is focused on a specific area. That's very motivating for some people to go that route. That's another way to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So then I'm wondering, I know a lot of the audience of this podcast is researchers, scientists. So are you on a mission to persuade people like them to make the jump? Is it a good thing? Does the world need more scientists to get involved in policy? Or are you more interested just in supporting those people who choose to do it?
Maybe both. I think it's good for a scientist to realize that there's more things out there than just their project and how they can use this knowledge in society, right? So that is very valuable, even if you're just doing it when you're at the bench. And as a student, getting involved in things that give you that broader view, because then you go back to the lab and realize, why you're doing that and what is that going to do, long term. On the other side, right now, I think there's a lot of students who are interested in going into policy, and the system doesn't really have doesn't really train you to do that very well. Which is good in a sense because everybody who has transitioned has a different story and it's really interesting to hear. You kind of get to carve your own path, and I've enjoyed that aspect. But at the same time, I wish there was something more systematic that would help a student who wants to go into policy to know who to talk to, is there an office they can go to, right? That sort of thing. So there is the need for institutions to also build some of this resources for them to be able to transition.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, one reason I asked, so not to over-dramatize this, but is this dangerous? Well, dangerous might be too much, but you do hear from a lot of people about the importance of training the next generation of scientists, because we're going to need these kind of experts more and more in the future. And it sounds like you're talking about not just enabling scientists to work more with policymakers, but actually enabling them to jump ship and move into a policy field instead. Doesn't that pull in the other direction somewhat?
Yeah. I think this is a long time debate because we do need to maintain the research pipeline, but also, this idea of we're also training them to be successful in society and do other things.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one thing to say you need extra skills. You want to be a scientist? Cool. Okay, but you also need to be able to communicate about your work, to contribute to society, maybe to advise policy and so on. But it's another thing to say, okay, you're doing a PhD and you're a promising researcher. Maybe in 10 years you'll be a PI, but have you considered jacking it all in and going to work in advocacy or whatever? I mean, that one could seem a bit more threatening, maybe. Or is there space for both?
Yeah, that's it's a tricky question, I guess, because I'm sort of on both camps in that I spend a lot of time, and my job, I think, is sort of in this space of how do we maintain the pipeline given the pandemic. We advocate for more research. We had a panel with students and postdocs where we're sort of said, okay, tell your story, the things you're not able to do now because of the pandemic, and sort of use that to advocate for, research recovery. And so I definitely agree that we need to maintain this, but at the same time, if there's people that have other ideas, we need to build that pipeline to where they can transition out of academia if they want to.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about that pipeline then. If you're a young researcher and this idea of policy work is appealing, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that there isn't necessarily a door you can go and knock on. There isn't necessarily someone you can just go and talk to, except people like you, I guess.
Yes, and I do that, happily do that as well. I've become somewhat of a mentor for students now who are looking for this, and I do kind of one-on-one meetings too. I think, so what I would say is it's very hard the way the academia is set up because it's very geared towards building more faculty, and you're sort of building that pipeline. And in terms of, what universities can do, I think part of it is working on improving the environment for early career researchers when they're still at the bench. That will, I think, facilitate some of this exploration too. The other way to think about it is, there's a lot of science PhDs who go into policy, which I think is very helpful. But if I were, in undergrad now, I would think, maybe I wouldn't have gone the science route, right? So you might be able to, get a master's in policy or something like that may be more relevant. So if you know earlier where you want to go, you may not pursue certain things, right? So there's different routes.
And what about deciding if it's for you? What kind of skills or personality traits might make someone take this idea seriously?
Well, I guess I can say from my day job, there's a lot of writing. You're always summarizing data, a lot of information into a little paragraph, which is the main thing that you want to put forth. So learning how to write for non-scientific audiences is really helpful, even if you're just doing blogging or something that gives you a different perspective. It's not so technical. It's very fast-paced. I'll say that you have to be able to switch between a lot of different priorities and projects in any given day. Sometimes things will happen in DC. The president will do something, then we have to write a letter in response. It's kind of exciting, but it could be also stressful for somebody who likes to plan everything and know what they're going to do when they go in. This is not the job for you. But I think that's one thing that's exciting about it, is that you are really, in real time responding to the issues that are going on. You really have the option to influence legislation and, the research that's going on. And I think that's helpful. You do have to be kind of on your feet all the time, though, because of that. So even though it's pretty regular as far as hours go, the things that you end up doing are sometimes can't predict what your day will be.
Yeah, and I can see how that can be very different from your typical academic role where you're kind of doing your own research and planning it all and carrying it out step by step.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how do people acquire those different skills? What kind of training or experience is available to help them do that?
Given we just discussed, there is no systematic way to do that. You kind of have to, do your own thing. What has been really helpful in my transition is volunteering with groups that work on issues that I was interested in, because that's really helpful. I think it gives you kind of a path and something to focus on that you can organize all your activities around, and also gives you a reputation that, okay, this person is interested in, advocating for a specific thing, and then people get to know you, that this is what you're interested in, they invite you to things and you become sort of the expert in that. So that's the advice I would have is, pick something that you're interested in and kind of build your portfolio around that, because that will teach you the skills that you need, but you'll also be focused on a certain direction that you want to take, and that will help. I mentioned the kind of things I've done. I've done a lot of blogging early on about higher education issues just because I had a lot to say and wanted to get that out.
And this was just like off your own bat because you wanted to do it rather than for an organization.
Yes, very, very proactive, just sort of, exploring, looking for opportunities to write, looking for podcasts to be on, different places even early on, as I was still very early and just left academia and already had, things that I thought needed to change, and I wanted people to know that. Then if you can, as a student, I think if you don't want to necessarily fully commit, there's also things you can do that will give you exposure to advocacy, like Capitol Hill days or something like that, where you get a little bit of taste of what it's like, then you go back to a lab and, realize it's not for you, and that happens, right?
So okay, what's a Capitol Hill day? I mean, I presume it's going to Capitol Hill and spending the day there.
Yeah, so it's basically an organized effort to advocate for a few issues. So a lot of times it'll be organized by, for example, scientific societies. A lot of them have their own Hill days every year. They have specific priorities, right? So I was at the Society for Neuroscience, so that was very specific to, we advocate for neuroscience funding and training and maybe one other point. And then you have sort of this unified front of people who are going to, offices on the Hill and making these 3 points, right, basically. A lot of that is, there is a training component to where if there are students involved, and this has become, I think, a way to involve students in the field, because they get selected to go to this Hill Day. They participate in usually like a one-day training. They get to go there, sometimes, a lot of times you'll have the staff, but sometimes you do see, the senator in there. So that's pretty cool, for a student to be in the room, and it really gives you that exposure. But it is also somewhat in a controlled environment, right? To where, like, here are the points we want you to make.
Okay. And given that, as you say, there's no kind of established pathway to this, maybe it's more useful for me to ask, what was your own story? What path did you follow?
So, when I realized I didn't want to go into academia, I was sort of getting interested in the training aspect of, how do institutions train students for different careers. Went to the office that works with that. I think one of the postdoc offices there, and said, can I volunteer? Can you tell me what your job is like? What do you do? Thinking at the time I wanted to maybe work in administration and develop programs and resources to sort of fill this gap, right? Things that don't exist that need to be developed. And that person became sort of a higher ed mentor, I guess, to where, that was his area. He's been in administration for a long time. He was running this office. And so I learned from him about, how he thinks about training, and then where the people are who are doing these things, right? He helped me build my network. So I sort of went from there to build out, I guess, this network of people who could help or had the knowledge I needed to see in order to transition, that these people were not PIs, right? So I think that's one thing I would say is, finding somebody who is in that role, who's willing to be a mentor, or maybe, partially, maybe they can connect you to someone else and kind of build that pipeline. And as I mentioned, blogging is always good. And these things, like, there's a lot of groups that are always looking for people to write, because it's a win-win, right? Because you want to build your reputation, but they also need people to write so they can keep their blogs going. So that is a good way to start. And I've seen a few institutions that have a little, training here and there for communication or advocacy. I think this is becoming more common, but it's still not very standardized, right? So there'll be, I don't know, maybe 5 universities that have something like this. And if you're not at that one, that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it, honestly, now comes from the outside. There's a lot of nonprofits and different organizations that are in this space and advocating for improving academia, and they're developing their own, workshops to teach students how to learn some of these things, right? So a lot of it still comes not from the institution, but people have used that to sort of streamline or transition out.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking that your journal, Science, Policy and Governance, also has this as part of its mission, this kind of support?
Yeah, so I mean, it's been a good stepping stone for a lot of students who want to go into policy, because it gives you, I think one thing is having this credential of having a policy publication is very valuable. And, we have started doing more sort of professional development and workshops and writing workshops. So some of these things that I talked about, right, that are not being taught in universities, like sort of complementing some of that. And we also have an editorial board, which is early career. So that's another way to gain this experience as far as professional development for trainees. So all these things, we do publish, but we also give them some professional development opportunities as part of it.
Okay, thanks. You've also talked and written about the higher education system more structurally. So it's not just, okay, I want to get out of academia and into policy, what do I need to do? It's also about what needs to change in academia in kind of the institutional setup so that the transition is easier. And so people are supported to make the jump. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think just realizing that, this model of training future PIs isn't going to work because that is very narrow. And a lot of young people nowadays have a lot of different ideas what they want to do. I would say developing some sort of curriculum that teaches you how to talk about science to non-scientists. I would love to see, communications programs, science communication training, advocacy, all these things, because I do think that, I guess, coupled with some sort of practical experience is really helpful for, even if you just do for a semester, learn a little bit about how do I translate my science? Can I get, to experience for a month or two and then go back to a lab, right? So that really helps.
And is this, do you mean like at an undergraduate level?
That's a good question. It's hard to know. I would say yes, the earlier the better. But at the same time, college, sometimes people still don't know what they want to do and they might change again. So grad school is a good place because you're already maybe a little more advanced. And also the PhD is pretty versatile, I guess. You can use it for different things. So if at that point you're developing your science and also your advocacy at the same time, that is a good combination because it gives you more options. I think at the same time, institutions aren't very transparent about where their students go as far as career outcomes. And again, I've sort of done a little bit of this work trying to see what this looks like across the US, where people go. And if there was more data about, certain institutions, these students are going into policy, other institutions, they're going into other careers, right? Then you might want to develop something that will help that, right? More targeted that way, but you need more data.
And the other obvious question, since we're talking about what needs to happen, is whether there are any examples you know of good practice, institutions that are doing it well.
I would say not too many. I've seen a couple of institutions that, have mentoring programs. This is becoming more common, I think, to, train the trainer sort of thing. Like, how do you teach faculty to be good mentors? These are starting to, I think, pop up here and there. Some institutions or some departments do consider this as part of the hiring practices. But again, that isn't a common practice, which I think it would be helpful to say, how do you evaluate the mentoring capacity before you hire the faculty, right? And then on the other side, I think the accountability for this would be funding agencies doing something about, do they, a lot of them do have mentoring plans in the grants, but they don't necessarily hold people accountable for doing that, which I think would also improve the system if there is some sort of consequence to not being a good mentor, right? That's a big conversation in the field.
Yeah, but I mean, aren't you always going to have this kind of structural problem, though, that the mentors that are available in the academic world are people by definition who have not switched to policy, but have in fact stayed in academia and become career researchers, which is all very well, but it's maybe not what you need the most if you want to know more about the other side of the fence, which I guess is why you talked also about other supporting organizations.
Yeah, I think that's important. And it's just, I think, gives you an open mind about what other careers might exist if you just meet people who have made the transition. And so I always advise students to do informational interviews to hear from people who are in jobs that they might want to pursue one day. But that also becomes your network, right? So I mean, I've tapped into my network again and again for different things, right?
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, so here's one thing I find interesting and a little bit kind of puzzling for me personally in this conversation. So my training was mostly in philosophy. And in philosophy, certainly at the university I was at, there were absolutely loads of conversations about what people would do when they finished their degrees. And there was almost no expectation, even at postgraduate level, that we'd all go on to become professional philosophers. I mean, that's kind of a joke. And even when I came to do my PhD, I don't think many of my cohorts, it was a tiny cohort, but we were never going to go on and become PIs. Again, there isn't really such a thing as a PI in philosophy, but you know what I mean. So there were lots of conversations about people going into law, into education, into government roles, policy roles, and so on. And then there were also people like me who kind of blundered backwards into politics and science communication. So when you describe this pipeline, it doesn't quite chime with my experience. Now, do you think that difference is because of my discipline? Like maybe in the experimental sciences, there's more of an expectation of training people from the start to become the next generation of scientists.
Yeah, that's probably true. Although I'll say when I was a postdoc, I actually started this seminar to bring speakers to talk to postdocs about different careers. So even at that stage, because a lot of times people don't realize that they don't want to be academics until they get to their postdoc, and then there should be another option, right? So I think, again, if you build a structure and the options and they at least get to hear about what they could do, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they might pursue that full time, but it still gives you an idea of, oh, this person works in medical writing, or I don't know, something that is adjacent, but not exactly, but maybe you want to do that one day, right? So I think you're touching on one issue here that the academic pipeline is very fixed, I guess. So sort of once you're the PI, that's kind of your whole life, and you run, develop your lab, you run your lab, and that's what you do. And I know that because my parents do that. But once you start, I think, down the policy route, or probably even other areas too, it's much more fluid to where you can say, okay, I'm going to work for government for 5 years and go work for university. There's a lot more options, and the expectations isn't that you'll be running your lab forever, right? So this is something to keep in mind, is that if, you're an academic thinking about another option, that there are a lot of careers out there, but also you're not sort of stuck in that path if that's not what you want to do, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. So until now, we've mostly been talking about switching career paths, so leaving science behind and going to work in a science-related part of policy. But a lot of what we talk about other times on this podcast is more of a hybrid thing, where scientists get their hands dirty in the political world. They give policy advice, or they sit on committees, or they represent the area of research they work in. But that is kind of moonlighting alongside their regular day job of being a career scientist. Or I guess in more enlightened setups, it might not be moonlighting. It can be built into their role, but they still haven't left science behind. And they usually do go on to become PIs and make their mark on the academic world too. Is that area also something you have experience with? And is any of what we've said so far relevant to people in those kind of roles?
Yeah, I think also from a personal experience, and I think now there's a lot more, even grad students who are thinking about their career options early, which is nice to see. In their first year, they're already exploring, is this what I want to do? Is there something else? How do I gain experience? These things take time. Like I mentioned, takes, 2-3 years to really build that up. I think if you do want to stay in academia, there are ways to gain this experience. Like I mentioned, the Capitol Hill days, that's a really good sort of practical experience to see what it's like to be on the Hill. You may have not like that, to go back to a lab, it's fine. In the sense of, as I mentioned too, I think it's important to develop these skills of being able to explain your research to a non-scientist. And these things exist, they've been more sort of these outreach examples, or, there's something like Beer with a Scientist. You go to a bar and talk to people about science, basically. And it's very open-ended. There's people there, have no idea what you're doing. And that can give you a good perspective of, again, how people view your research who are from outside, right? And I think it gives you a good perspective on that. So even if you're, staying in the lab, I still encourage people to communicate about their science in different ways, not just through their papers, right? Even for students, now, the environment that we're in now, I think there's a lot of opportunities in, virtual webinars or workshops. So there's things you can learn from home while you're still in training. Those are important. And also mentioned, doing informational interviews. So that's always helpful, again, just to learn from other people, grow your network and see what other options are there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, those skills seem like they're useful for career scientists anyway.
Yeah. Training, the future faculty pipeline also requires other skills that are not just doing your research, right? So it still comes back to this idea of we need to train, postdocs how to, manage budgets, how do you manage a team? It's like a business, right? In a sense. So again, these things need to exist, or we need to implement that somewhere before you give somebody a faculty job, because there's going to be a lot more things they have to do.
Yeah, right. So one thing I've heard discussed a bit recently is the concept of incentives. So the suggestion that the kinds of activities which scientists do so they can contribute to policymaking are not necessarily acknowledged or rewarded in their career progression in a way that encourages them to do it, basically. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think you just see this culture of, competition, or what people even call it, hyper competition, to where, and I don't even know what it takes these days to get a tenure track position. It just seems like it's so hard. But, everybody, this competition of, how many papers did you publish? How much money is your grant? So the focus is very much on sort of like, the products, and you're measuring your success by that. I think, and sort of these other things we're talking about, incentives for, teaching people science communication, like that's fine, but it's not going to get you another grant, right? So the whole structure needs to change. If you want to implement some of this, then you need to have, mentoring, for example, be part of, the training, the grants, like I mentioned, then reward people who do a good job or not, right? And change the incentives from just being, the number of papers published to actually, how did you train your people, right? So that gets to the whole kind of question of success. So what is a successful scientist, or, you're as a PI, how do you know if your people succeed, right? So it is to an extent is the product, but you want to mentor your people so they can go and, do good things in society, become leaders. You're training leaders, right? Essentially, not just a person that can publish another paper, right? So that's different. So more about the people in the pipeline than the research, I would say. Or that's part of why I'm interested in this question, because I think there's a lot there, and it's important to focus on that too.
Yeah, clearly. Okay, we have to talk before we finish about the pandemic, much as my heart sinks. Actually, you mentioned earlier on that in some ways, COVID has made the kind of experience we've been discussing a bit easier, because it's so much easier now to jump into an online event in an area outside your own academic field, and so get a taste for these things. As well as that, there's certainly been an increase in public attention on academics interacting with policymakers. Do you think there's also an increase in demand or in student interest corresponding to that?
Yeah, that's hard to know. I think there's and I don't know if that's because of the pandemic or not, I have seen a lot more trainees who are interested in policy. I would say that was also true before the pandemic. But I've also heard people say that this has made them realize why they have to go into policy, because it gives you, opportunity to have a broader impact. And obviously, if I were a grad student now, I would think about, what else can I do, right? Which is good and bad, I suppose, because we are losing people from the pipeline to other things. But I think it's given people time to reflect and think, do I really want to be an academic? What other things can I do? Let me watch a webinar, right? So it's shifted people's perceptions, I think, just because they have time to think about other things, right? Because I think if you're, in the lab 24/7, you're doing that, sometimes it's hard to, you forget that you have to develop your other areas in professional development. But now, because things are slower and they can only do so much, it's kind of foster this, slowing down, thinking about, okay, do I still want to go, this direction? Can I, take an online class, develop, so I think it's helping people develop other things.
Mm-hmm. And more generally, do you think it's happening overall? Are you optimistic? Are things moving in the right direction?
A little bit. I think the issue is, like I said, that it's not, there is no sort of system to make sure that people are learning these things, like, how to be a good mentor, being able to take, science communication training, right? So I think these are basic things regardless of what you're doing in the future. But there's still very few universities that offer those options, right? So I think there is a shift from maybe 5 years ago, but it's very slow.
So last question, would you personally consider making a switch back? Would you ever go back to a pure research career path?
No, definitely not.
Why not?
Well, yeah, I think, it goes back to the whole reason why I left, I guess. So I like the intellectual challenge of it, but I never felt like it was giving me any sort of impact in society. It felt like very, it had a very clear end. So I'm working to publish so I can graduate because we need, this publication because it was required to graduate. It's a very, very dead end, sort of, in a way, because it's very hard to see how that will help another person right down the line. And I think policy, has given me this sort of broad view of things. I'm trying to influence it now from the legislative side, so very high level, something like how much funding do we allocate to the NSF to create programs to train students, right? So that's sort of my path, and I can do it sort of from a high level. Again, the institutional sort of impact is one way, and obviously a lot of people like that strategy of being able to develop programs where you're having the direct impact and you see sort of the impact on the students. But at the same time, I don't know, I enjoy this sort of maybe far removed high level view of and more impact. And academia is pretty much the opposite of that, right? With your lab work.
Yeah.
So,
so I hear. Well, then I hope you continue to find what you do rewarding and to help others to have the same experience. Dr. Adriana Bankston, thanks very much for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here.
The Science for Policy podcast is produced by SAPEA. We're a consortium of Europe's academies and learning societies, and we're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism. We provide evidence and expertise to inform the work of the group of chief scientific advisors. SAPEA is funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 programme for research and innovation, and you can find lots more information about us and our work at sapea.info. Finally, the rather lovely cello music that's playing right now is performed by Elizaveta Sushchenko, so I shall shut up and let you enjoy the last few bars. Bye for now.